So the title for this session is Curriculum, Should it be prescribed or should teachers be autonomous? We're going to introduce the speakers in the order in which they're going to speak. They're going to have 2 minutes each to say something provocative and interesting for you, and then I'm going to give as much time as possible for your points and questions, and then the panel will have a chance to come back and reflect on those. So I'm Jason Smith, I'm Careers Lead at East London Science School. First to speak will be Summer Turner. Summer is a secondary teacher at East London Science School, where she's head of faculty for English and languages and leads on teaching and learning, including curriculum and assessment. Katie Ashford is deputy head and the director of inclusion at Michaela Community School in Wembley in London. Richard Woolfenden, my colleague as well at East London Science School, he's head of Year 9. And Martin Robertson has been a teacher for over 20 years in East London State Schools, currently an education consultant with a particular interest in curriculum, teaching and learning. So thank you all for agreeing to be on the panel. Summer, would you like to kick us off?
Thank you. Autonomy has been historically associated with a bit of a free-for-all when it comes to curriculum. Certainly starting my teaching career, I viewed autonomy as the opportunity to go into the classroom and teach what I wanted. The consequence being less a curriculum and more a bundle of skills-based approaches and exam specs. This autonomy, therefore, was problematic. I didn't have the expertise then to be allowed to run free rein on something as key as the curriculum. Looking at internationally successful education systems, it's clear that a level of prescription in terms of resources and even lesson plans has contributed to successes and to the ability of schools and teachers to implement more rigorous, knowledge-driven curriculum. However, behind this prescription lies the story of education systems focused on developing teachers and on building subject and curriculum expertise. If you've read Lucy Crehan's book Cleverlands, you will see that autonomy is actually a key feature of these education systems, but it's a structured autonomy with prescription available when and where necessary. What these countries have in common is a two-prong approach. Firstly, the use of communities of subject experts to develop meaningful subject curriculum and resources, and secondly, a dedication to CPD, which allows teachers to build this expertise themselves until they're able to pick and choose the level of prescription because they have the requisite knowledge to do this. Thus, academia is valued and teachers are established as academic authorities. One of my concerns about adopting a fully prescriptive approach to knowledge is that we're in danger of devaluing the academic purpose behind teaching and removing the idea of the power of an autonomous subject expert who is able to fully embody their subject without restriction. We need to both accept the pragmatic and the ideal, building subject communities to create curriculum, including prescriptive resources for those schools and teachers lacking the expertise, whilst at the same time shaping curriculum leadership within schools. If schools do not understand the importance of curriculum and have not made that intellectual journey themselves, we're in danger of creating a new version of prescribed Ofsted style of teaching, which may have short-term impact in creating a knowledge focus within schools, but will not change things long-term. Ultimately, when choosing a knowledge curriculum, we need to do so because we are informed, because we embody that knowledge as a profession, and we can be trusted to use this wisely. We're far from that reality, but that does not mean it is not within our grasp.
Katie.
I think it's really interesting when you think about new teachers who are new to the profession. And when I started teaching on Teach First a few years ago, I certainly felt that I needed some autonomy because there were no curricula in place in the school I was teaching at. And the national curriculum, well, there wasn't really a national curriculum, it was just a set of skills, which means that I was quite pleased that I was able to kind of choose, we'll do a bit of Bronte, we'll do a bit of Keats, because I thought that those texts were quite important. But obviously that was just my those were my likes and dislikes, and that's what I chose to teach according to what I liked and disliked. And some of my colleagues, there was a girl that I knew who taught in another school, was also teaching English, and she'd specialised in feminism at university. And so throughout her 2 years of teaching, she taught pretty much every text through the lens of feminism, which is great, and there's nothing wrong with looking at things through the lens of feminism, but it was perhaps a bit too much, and it meant that children could only really understand what was happening through that lens. And so whilst I do think that autonomy in itself is quite a kind of beguiling idea, I do think that actually it comes at quite a high cost. And the costs, I think, affect the pupils in that I don't think they get as high a quality curriculum as they're entitled to. And I think it also affects staff. It affects teachers because it increases workload, and it actually moves your shift away from how to teach the content to what you're teaching. So instead, every kind of half term or every evening when you go home and you're planning your lessons, you're thinking, God, what am I going to teach tomorrow? Okay, quickly, let me read chapter 3 of Mice and Men and decide what points I want the children to get from it. Rather than thinking, okay, what specific ideas am I going to convey? How am I going to explain those points? How am I going to make sure that they've understood them? Especially when you start off as a new teacher, I think that if you don't have a prescribed curriculum in place, what ends up happening is two things end up becoming the curriculum by proxy, and that's either what Ofsted wants, so they want to see engaging lessons, and if you're in a school like I was that's kind of very much beholden to Ofsted because it's received a low grade in recent years, you have no choice but to do as Ofsted would dictate and just kind of teach fairly vacuous, skillsy lessons that are slightly fun and engaging just for the sake of it. And secondly, if you don't prescribe the curriculum, you might end up just teaching to the exam. And that's also what happens in a lot of schools, particularly those that are under pressure to ensure that they get great exam results. Giving teachers autonomy, so I think, reduces the quality of instruction in that it's very difficult to think yourself on your own of the best way, for example, to describe what a simile is. So the best way to describe a simile to a child is to come up with a sequence of examples that demonstrate what that simile is, what that concept means. And it's difficult for you to come up with those off the top of your head, but equally it's difficult for you to come up with those, on your own if you've never taught it before. And actually it means that you might end up teaching that concept incorrectly. You might end up teaching it in a suboptimal way, which means that not every single child in the room will come to understand and learn that concept, which seems to me to be quite a shame. Now, obviously, there are a number of teachers, and I'm sure many of the teachers in the room today, who are very experienced and do know the best possible way to teach certain concepts. And so I think new teachers and teachers who perhaps aren't as strong as other teachers ought to have the humility to stand on the shoulders of giants, to use a phrase that's been used today, to kind of put aside their own desire for autonomy and to realise that actually optimal instruction, the best examples, the best sequencing is what's right for their pupils, and that sometimes that requires adhering to a prescribed curriculum.
I'm going to sort of approach this a bit through the prism of being a returnee teacher. I was a teacher in East London in the 90s. The pull factor away was the attraction of working in film, and I ended up working in film in education in a sort of Ken Robinson hinterland. More about that over a drink perhaps. But I've come back to teaching sort of 20 years on in East London, only 3 miles down the road from the school that I started at. And my immediate draw and attraction is the sense of a school-based autonomy. How a school works that through in terms of curriculum is down to the school. Whether that means a completely teacher-led autonomy, I don't think so, because we have to work together as colleagues in departments in a sort of leadership structure. But I think as far as the national curriculum goes and in terms of prescriptions from above, from government, that's broken, isn't it? That's gone. We've got the majority of schools in the UK, I keep on hearing the stats now, are academies and free schools, and we don't have to follow the national curriculum in the same way. So we're not being prescribed to from above in that sense. So it's down to us, and it's down to how we want to work through in a school-based manner, what works for our students. And I think that as a returnee to teaching is incredibly inspiring and exciting. And I think the community and some of the community we have in this room, being able to draw on as a teacher, and the expertise in this room and beyond is part of what makes this possible as a way of going forward. And just to sort of put into context why I think it's so important, if I look at my own education and what wasn't offered and what is possible now in terms of curriculum, I think it really makes me reflect on why autonomy at a school-based level is so exciting and so vital for our students. I was educated in the 70s in a rural comprehensive, where if you've read David Crystal's book, Making Sense about grammar, it was just after grammar was, English teaching of grammar was switched off. completely. We didn't engage with it at all. And our teachers were also not particularly interested in introducing us to Shakespeare. I think we read Twelfth Night, but with so little excitement or passion or interest that it could have put me off if I hadn't been lucky to be a regular theatre goer because of my parents. I jumped forward to the 90s in a city, East London, where there was such a crushing relativism in the curriculum. It was enough to drive people out of education. It did in droves. The only reason why we were studying Romeo and Juliet was because it was a text that could relate to teenagers, and that was the whole focus. And excellence was actually a dirty word. I sat on a panel at school where we were trying to look at how we would promote our own department, and I said, well, what about academic excellence? And everyone looked at me and said, you've got to be joking. If we put that out then as an idea, then people actually might want to try and hold you to it. So I think autonomy in terms of the curriculum is vital. How you organise that in a school, that's down to the school and how you organise in terms of leadership, but it's definitely the way forward.
Thank you, Richard. Martin.
Right. I wonder if I was a maths teacher, I'd approach this differently. But as someone who's not had to teach a subject as part of any national curriculum for 20 odd years, it's a creative arts subject to teach, and perhaps that changes my view on things. I don't know. But should it be prescribed? Should the curriculum be prescribed? No. Straightforward. Why? Because, and this came up, I think, with the difficulties some people have with pedagogy. To me, pedagogy and the subject are intrinsically linked. If you design the curriculum, you're also designing how to teach it, and you're designing the discipline of the subject as well. So you're not only talking about, this is the way this subject goes, how am I going to teach it? You're actually thinking how you're disciplining the kids at various points throughout as well. The whole thing is organic, if you like. It all holds together. The trouble with the national curriculum or any curriculum imposed is it takes away that from the teacher. So the teacher needs to be autonomous. Then we have the problem, if every teacher is teaching their own thing, the kid doesn't get the story, because it changes all the time, so they don't follow through. So the autonomy has to be communal. It has to be agreed and reviewed by the community of teachers, either at school level or MAT level or whatever level you happen to have in your particular organisation. And then you put the curriculum together and you think of it as a story, an unfolding story. You're telling that story over time. So it's not just nuggets of knowledge here and there, and various techniques that you're going to use, gimmicks as a teacher. It's an unfolding narrative that goes through. And you're passing on knowledge, you're conserving that. But you're also telling that story in a way. All right, look, hang on. Let's bring in Ayn Rand for fun. It's always good to bring in Ayn Rand for a bit of fun. Now, she looks at two novels and says there's a difference between a naturalistic novel and art and romantic art, okay? And the idea is, for her, that the naturalism, so War and Peace, she chooses. You're buffeted by the way things are, whereas Les Miserables shows you someone taking control, acting under volition. Now, to me, this is where romanticism has its place, by the way. That you're trying to pass on a body of knowledge, but you're also, and this is the creative artist in me, giving the volition to the child to do something with that knowledge. So you're taking on a story as a body of facts, a body of knowledge, then you're giving it to them to look at characters within that story, arguments, ideas over time, and for them to tussle with these arguments and ideas and conflicting narratives that come together. And then you're giving it to them to say, right, now come up with something, whether it be an essay, whatever it happens to be at the end of it, a work of art, that makes sense of that under their own volition. So you're moving on from one thing to another to another. So the curriculum is central. The teaching is central to it. Now, to me, of course, some sort of schema helps you to work this one out. And for me, it's the trivium. It goes back centuries, talking about standing on the shoulders of giants. You've got the grammar of the subject, the knowledge, the skills, the way of doing things, the story. And you put that together with the arguments of time. You bring in conflicts, ideas. It's a good narrative. It's a good narrative structure. What Whittingham says, characters and arguments are brilliant ways to remember things. And then finally, in the rhetoric, they reach out to the world with their own creation, whether it be the essay, the exam, or the work of art that comes at the end of it. So please, think of it, evaluate it in any way you can, but is it prescribed? No. And the last point, if you prescribe something like a national curriculum, it's very, what Taleb calls, fragile. Because if you get it wrong, like 2007, every school has got it wrong. Every school has got it wrong. And that means for an entire generation of kids, apart from those who went to independent schools perhaps, for that entire generation of kids, they've had a national curriculum which hasn't worked in their interest. If you, as a group of teachers, get it wrong, you can quickly look at it, review it at the end of the year, and make sure you then don't get it wrong next year. You're not trying to turn the tank around of government policy or a scripted curriculum that's been given to you. You're not trying to turn that tank around. You are fleet of foot, and that always helps. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So, over to you to tussle with the conflicting narratives on the panel.
I was really worried about what Katie Ashford said about similes, that there's this idea that there's one perfect example of a simile, and also that, well, there's three things that worry me about it. Firstly, that we would have such low expectations of teachers that we think they couldn't think of examples of similes the night before teaching a lesson which involves similes. That really worries me. The second thing is, that there's not one perfect example, and what really struck me from this morning was the idea of a conversation, and that you have to listen to the everyday knowledge of your pupils. You have to be aware of who's in front of you, and the examples that you give are going to be in response to that. The third thing is that teachers, like learners, need to be able to make mistakes, and we need to, as a new teacher or as an experienced teacher, you need to try out one example and realize, oh, actually that group of kids didn't get it. I need to be flexible. I need to try a different example, a different model, a different image. And if we just learn as teachers and give scripts to teachers, the same as if we do it for pupils, we won't really encourage teachers to think in that more intellectual way. So that is what worries me.
Hi, just to pick up on something Richard said about how the increase in academies and free schools seems to give more of an autonomy from the national curriculum because they're not beholden to it. I just wanted to ask if that's perhaps a false freedom, because now the control over the selection of educational knowledge is perhaps controlled more by exam boards in a culture in which we're beholden to exam results. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, that was going to be part of the point I was going to make, because I think that prescription comes in the form of exam requirements. But I do think also we want to get away from the assumption that the teacher is working alone, and I like very much what Martin was saying, that actually if you have groups of teachers who are confident in their subject knowledge, collaboratively, they may have their own individual preferences, but those can be argued out, and collaboratively, possibly, you can provide a better curriculum that actually isn't just about what works for your students, because I think we want to be aiming for something that is more than that. Because I think if you're just thinking about what works for your students on that very in a parochial way, you do get some people, and I've seen it happen, who will say, well, our kids can't do this, or our kids can't do that. So you actually got to rise above that and really think and get to grips with what knowledge is, and what knowledge is what you want to initiate every child into, wherever they come from.
I've heard from a number of senior leaders in different schools talking about how prescribed curriculum is time consuming. Oh, no, sorry, it's them saving time for teachers. Isn't actually the planning of the lessons part of the enjoyment of teaching, and isn't that how you get your passion across, whereas a prescribed lesson could possibly be quite boring to deliver?
Okay, panel, anything you would like to come back on to tackle? Same order we started with Summer.
Yeah, I'll take that last question, actually. I think this is around the workload question. I think that's a really important issue that needs to be raised, because I think I've heard people speak very eloquently about why prescription does solve the workload crisis. And I think that there is a sense in which teachers are overburdened, and therefore doing the lesson planning itself is something that's just adding to that burden. This is actually, interestingly, not something that's recent. This has been historically an issue. So even before national curriculum was put in place, when teachers were surveyed about curriculum, they said they didn't feel they had time to design curriculum, even when it was more autonomous. So this has been historically a problem. What I would say, actually kind of agree with what Peter's saying there, is about where we place the focus. And I think that there's a risk that in schools that we've focused on the wrong things. So we really should be encouraging, this is why I think it's really important for school leaders to understand the central role of curriculum, because if they cannot understand that, they are not going to make the space and time for teachers to develop their lesson plans, develop their curriculum. So you're looking at actually trying to change the entire system of what it means to be a school. And so that's a really huge thing to take on, and it's something that we have to kind of start small with. But I think that there's potential for, whilst that's happening, for some level of prescription to be available. That it's not that it's you have to do this, but there's research, there are really fantastic textbooks or really fantastic resources available, so that whilst the journey of changing into the kind of schools we want to be is happening, it's not completely putting all the onus on teachers, because otherwise, a lot of the excitement around curriculum is coming from teachers who are new into the profession, who don't necessarily have that leadership role or experience themselves, and leaders are not trained on that themselves either. So whilst we're building that expertise, you kind of need to have something that goes along with it to allow people to make that time.
Thank you. The panel should feel free to come back directly on anything you disagree with about your other.
I was just going to pick up on the point about the similes worries, and I too share several of the concerns that you raised. I'm definitely worried about the fact that, unfortunately, there are teachers who don't know what similes are. I mean, there are teachers who can't spell. I've seen teachers teach children that the word lovely is an adverb when it isn't, it's an adjective. So, unfortunately, that is part of the issue in this country, as has been raised many times by several of the colleagues in the room, about the lack of subject knowledge, and in particular the lack of subject pedagogical knowledge. Also, obviously, simile was used as a fairly kind of small example, but there are more complex concepts, particularly in maths, for example, teaching somebody a complex formula. I mean, this is showing my lack of maths knowledge. I literally can't even think of an example of something hard in maths to use to illustrate this point. But yeah, so, there are things that are incredibly complex, and there are a number of different methods, and there are some methods that have been shown to be more effective for the vast majority of pupils than others. In addition to that, it might be worth looking into the Project Follow-Through research that was done in the States. It was a really longitudinal study that was looked at different types of curriculum that we used, and it was shown that Siegfried Engelmann's direct instruction curriculum was hugely successful at ensuring that every single child really learned mathematical concepts and literary concepts to a really high standard of mastery. And so whilst it does feel very constraining, and on the point about it being boring and getting your joy from planning your lessons, I totally see, and I was nodding when you were saying that, because I'm thinking, yeah, I totally understand where you're coming from on that. It does seem very dry. What I would say is that at Michaela, one thing I'm really proud of is how we've managed as a staff to kind of shift the content away, to shift the focus away from how can I use variety to demonstrate my passion for my subject, and how can I use different activities and different ways of exploring content to demonstrate my passion, to just the content itself is so amazing. I absolutely love physics, so I'm going to teach physics and I'm going to share that passion for physics with my kids. I absolutely love literature, so I'm going to share that passion with my kids. And I think if you try and move the focus as a school towards that, then actually you can still inject as much passion into your teaching as you might be able to through planning of lessons. So yeah.
If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done autonomously. My eldest, who goes to the local exam factory, who's in GCSE year this year, came back from school and said, "Run that past me again, Dad, iambic pentameter." And I nearly shot myself. She's year 11, and right from the beginning of school, it hasn't been drummed into her how important iambic pentameter is. You cannot escape East London Science School in Year 7 without knowing the importance of iambic pentameter, and that's very much down to Summer's work on the curriculum, and it's repeated in Year 8, and it's repeated in Year 9 as the beating heart of English poetry. You have to know it to be able to understand English literature, and that's the key to dealing with the exam pressure and teaching to the exam. They have to know this, and they have to know this above and beyond what is going to be demanded at GCSE and at exam level. They have to know this knowledge, and it's having the confidence as a school and as a corpus and as a body of teachers that we know that this is important, that makes it is our shield against the pressure when it comes to the examination boards. I imagine in the next 5-6 years there'll be a whole swathe of schools that will now start to call themselves knowledge schools, but they will not be able to change from their dastardly exam grade chasing ways, but they will call themselves knowledge schools. But they won't be able to break the habit, but that's what they'll call themselves.
Okay. I'll take the point about what the schools, the kids around here don't like that sort of thing, or it's not for them, or whatever. The important thing, I think, is your guiding principles. The school needs to have some sort of set of guiding lights, if you like, a manifesto like the pre-Raphaelites. Yeah, pulling together this idea, so we go back to the classical, we pull it out, and these guiding principles say that you must teach the best that's been thought, said and done, things like that, that you must have these things there. And we must argue about what the texts are, we can argue forever about what the text should be, and so we should. Because these texts are important. These nuggets of knowledge are important. And the order in which they unfold. Yeah, and the way that they're set up against each other. And that, once you're involved in, and you see what I mean, that for me, the whole discipline comes from that whole discussion. And it needs to be thought about in terms of the subject, more so than the kids, perhaps. This is the important art that we are creating here. Yeah, and the kids will go along with it, I promise you. They damn well will. And when you've taught T.S. Eliot to kids, we're talking about kids who are, school refusers and zooming around and truanting, when you're trying to get them to learn Murder in a Cathedral, line for line, you make them do it. And they do it because you're determined to teach this piece of work. And they feel that, they understand that. So, talk about getting them to agree to it, or whatever. They do, because you are there and you are driving this through, and they're part of that whole narrative. They're drawn along, they're taken along all the way.
Okay, this will have to be the final round of questions.
I want to point out two sort of demographic factors here. First of all is the age of teachers. I think teachers, the profession is being more and more put in the hands of really quite young people, if I may say that. There's an awful lot of people running schools who are quite young and relatively inexperienced. Now, there's nothing particularly wrong with that. It's good that you have sort of fresh blood, but at the same time, I think those people have come into teaching with a totally different view of teaching that I had when I trained, and they're much more focused on a pedagogical approach to it. And so they tend to look at older, more experienced people and say, yeah, well, you might have some interesting ideas about curriculum, but the way you teach, man, that's kind of like dinosaur stuff, and that's just not going to work anymore. And I think there's an important voice of experience that's been lost because of the need to teach in kind of fixed pedagogical formats these days, because it's all evidence-based and all the latest research will tell you and blah, blah, blah. And the other thing, very quickly, is that I think those schools that are trying to do things differently and schools that are operating on a sort of explicitly pro-knowledge agenda, not exclusively, but mostly are quite young schools.
And nobody is going to accept anything they do or say until they get some really, really good exam results. And I think it's difficult because schools have to deliver those exam results, and we all know that as you come closer and closer to that deadline, you are going to have to teach to a certain extent to the test, not least because those exams are not knowledge exams. If you put down stuff that's been taught really well, you may well get that question wrong. And so there is a sort of, it's not just easy to say, let's not worry about exam specs. Everyone who's running schools at the moment, I think, trying to do this is worried about what those exams are really going to be like when they come through.
I couldn't work out whether any of you really want the curriculum or not. So if I was a parent, I think I wouldn't, like, looking at you guys, are you the committee that's going to choose the curriculum or go into the fields and run around and be autonomous? I don't know. I think I might bring that back, the national curriculum. So what's the problem with just having the government saying we need a national curriculum, that's what you need to teach? Because I think the questions you're raising are at a different level. I think, Katie, you're saying that about suboptimal lessons and workload. I mean, I don't think I've ever delivered what you call an optimal lesson. That's the point. You're ignorant. You and the student are ignorant. That's where the autonomy is. You recognise your ignorance. So have you got time to do that? Because I think your thing on workload, that's the deal. Teaching's hard work. So when you start, you probably haven't got time to do much apart from say, what have I got to teach? I'm going to do it. How you do it and how you bring it to life is the deal. So you need something above you to say that's what you're going to teach. At the other extreme, you've got some are saying leadership teams need to create the space. But that's a model of leadership, not curriculum. And I don't think schools are ever going to be like that. If they are, I don't know where they are, because you said there's all these international places that get it right, and they have CPD and so on, but I've never known a country like England which has got so much CPD going on, and it never seems to come back into the school. So I feel like we need to be a bit more sort of honest with ourselves about what the job of teaching means, what knowledge means, and saying maybe the government's should be confronting and saying what the curriculum is, because can teachers really be trusted? When you give them autonomy, they just go all over the place.
So I teach Mandarin in primary schools, which has a very subject-specific pedagogy, which sometimes alarms the teachers that I work with because it's very specific to learning Chinese, to learning a foreign language. And I find in that role that the children they don't ask what the purpose of it is, they just enjoy doing it. They enjoy it, they know it's difficult, they enjoy it, they learn it, they enjoy it because it's difficult. And I just, so in reference to that, I just wonder whether you think what a knowledge curriculum from primary school is, because you have children there who maybe don't give the pushback that you get at secondary school, and whether we're making enough of that potential in primary schools. When you get them in year 7, do you feel that there's been enough taught to them from a knowledge point of view?
Fear not, Mr. Woolfenden. Your fear for the iambic pentameter was noted by the 1969 O-level board, who were worried about pupils not knowing about iambic pentameter. I wonder if it's worth just making a distinction between sort of 3 levels: the national curriculum, a syllabus, and then the pedagogy within the classroom. And I'm thinking of Mr. Taylor's point there. I mean, in the abstract, you think, okay, a national curriculum, what's wrong with it? But I think in the context of Britain, you've got to recognise when it was brought in 1988, it was very much part of a concerted effort at reorganising established relationships and institutions in education. And prior to that point, as was indicated before, the syllabus and what happened in most schools was kind of wrought through the exam boards and then through local organisations and regional boards. So that was all scrapped. The national curriculum was then imposed very centrally. I personally don't mind the idea of a national curriculum, but I'm very concerned about what's in it. I mean, the question is what is going to be in that national curriculum. And just today, the government's announced it's going to put 20 million into schools teaching 14-year-olds how to become cyber security experts. To me, shouldn't be in the national curriculum. So it is a question, again, of what the content is. So that can be prescribed at the most general level, and it might be a good thing if you had a government that was prepared to make a value judgment and say, yes, we want disciplinary knowledge based on this and not cyber security on the curriculum. Thank you very much. before that. And then you work down to increasing levels of autonomy. The teacher has to be free to decide how best to teach a simile to that class on that day in their way, specific to that.
Thank you. Okay, so there's lots on the table there, panel, but this is also your summing up.
Okay, I tried to stick to the 2-minute limit on my speech, which is why perhaps not all my points have been fully explained. I should know not to stick to the rules. Exactly. I'll look at a couple of things. So, firstly, Gareth's point about that it's not realistic to say schools will not worry about examination specifications. I think that's completely true. I think that, unfortunately, a lot of schools will always worry about those things, and that a lot of school leadership and teachers will eventually kind of find that that's their focus. But I think we have to try and fight against that, and I think that's the only way we make movements forward. So I don't think that the youth of the profession is a problem. I think it's about ingrained ideas which have come through lack of expertise, and this is why I keep coming back to this idea of leadership teams, because it's about how you develop the professional expertise within schools and school communities. So if you say like, oh, nothing that matters, like each teacher just does their own thing and it's just hard work, you're not really understanding the kind of collaborative community approach that subjects need to have and that schools need to have in order to move things forward. One person cannot do that on their own. And so I think it's about, the reason that schools have become so obsessed with pedagogy and so obsessed with exam results, is an Ofsted-based thing and a league tables-based thing, but it's also because they didn't know anything about curriculum. So the problem with the national curriculum was it took it out of the hands of teachers and schools. It said, let's place control. Schools don't really know how to do this. We want to control this. And it controlled the curriculum through assessment. It controlled the curriculum through the national curriculum. And then, depending on the people in charge, therefore that dictated what type of curriculum was taught in schools. And actually that had quite a negative effect if you look at 97. So I think that we do need to feel that it's okay to say we don't have this expertise in curriculum and we don't have the subject communities existing that are having these conversations. I think we sometimes assume because we know what we're talking about, because we might be amongst people in our school who talk about our subject, that everybody else knows that. You go into schools, people who've gone into their teacher training, their PGCEs, they have hardly talked about their subject at all during their PGCE. They've gone straight into a school which doesn't talk about their subject. And it's not necessarily based on age, that's just based on the kind of people who've got to those positions. Sometimes the people who get to SLT position are people who teach the least amount of lessons, and they're not always subject specialists. So it's about, at what point in the journey is there ever people being inducted into a subject community, so therefore they can feel that that is the thing that we should be talking about, that is the thing that should dictate the programme. And on the CPD question, I think we ran some pretty good CPD at our school over the last few years around curriculum. We worked together in teams, actually building curriculum and having those really important conversations, which means that we've got a strength of curriculum we do now. And it's something that we come back to and review consistently. But that's why we have iambic pentameter going all the way through our curriculum, because we sat and we thought about what are the most important things we need in our curriculum. So that stuff does matter. I'm not talking about CPD going out for a nice lunch and an expensive talk. I'm saying what's happening within schools when we're discussing and building those subject communities.
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Summer says there. In terms of the question of a national curriculum, I similarly have reservations, and the reason I have reservations about it is just because we don't have a shared sense of what we want as a country. We're still really debating very fundamental ideas, and the only writer that anybody can agree on is Shakespeare, and the fact that we can't really agree on many more writers than that means that we're not yet, I think, in a position to be able to prescribe at least, the set texts that should be taught at Key Stage 3, for example, because obviously Key Stage 4 is pretty much dictated by the exam boards, which is, if the exam is good, is less bad. If the exam is terrible, then it's obviously not so great. The point about primary, I really do like thinking about primary and how knowledge could be applied in primary. I think particularly a lot of the kind of didactic methods in reception in year 1 when you're teaching basic number facts and basic reading and writing skills, I think would be really effective. I'm not a primary specialist, of course, but I am thinking about this a lot at the moment. And yeah, in the future, who knows, maybe there will be lots of primary schools out there that are doing lots of really great knowledge things. But I do think primary schools, from what I can tell, are so pressured by the Key Stage 2 SATs that actually it means that they don't do the best for their pupils, and that's not their fault. That is an example of the test really warping the curriculum in a really negative way. I mean, you know, if I was Queen, I would get rid of the Key Stage 2 SAT, I think, because it needs to be replaced with something that's actually good. Yeah, so, I mean, to summarise, I suppose I would say I don't think we're ready as a country to be able to prescribe at a curriculum level. I like the idea of having more kind of a community of teachers who sit around together and decide what they think is right. And then I think eventually you get this sense of, well, that curriculum there is working really well, this curriculum over here is working really well, what can we learn from each other, what can we try and do to learn from each other to improve our curricula until we eventually kind of get something that's really, really, really great. So that'd be what I'd say.
Yeah, I very much agree with that last point. I'm not against the national curriculum as a point of principle, but I think the government, especially in terms of, sort of secondary education, has stepped back from it and kind of given up on it on many levels. If you compare the primary school national curriculum, which is highly prescriptive compared to what they've put in place for the secondary sector, it seems to me that they've taken a step back, partly because of their own the way that they've encouraged the development of so many academies and free schools. This is an opportunity. This is a massive moment, I think, as David was speaking about earlier, that we have to seize. And if that means that we seize it within a inter-school level and across schools with sort of fellow schools like Michaela and others, we have to seize this moment and develop our own curriculum.
Pick on the primary idea as well. I think part of the community of knowledge makers and curriculum designers, if you like, involves secondary and primary, I think. And certainly if you teach in subjects, I mean, my daughter goes to a school, primary school, where they teach subjects. So she does dance, she does drama, she does science, she does geography, she does history, she does taiko drumming, you know, all these things, I don't know. But it's all timetable. So it protects the arts for a start if you have subjects, so that's one good thing for them at primary, but also it gives you, you know, you have the knowledge base that goes all the way through, and I think those conversations are important so we know if there is a transition. So it's an argument for all through schools. There's also the argument, of course, if you set off yourself badly, you want to go to another school, you should also have that chance, by the way. I don't think they're necessarily the nirvana. The thing about dinosaurs, I mean, I'm old enough to have been young once. And the great thing about having young people organising a curriculum is they're rebels, you know, they want to kick against the pricks and all that. But you need the pricks to stay there, to be kicked against and to offer some sort of balance, if you like, and say, well, hang on about this, that and the other. And to be wrong, both sides to be wrong, but to have that conversation. So if you're entirely a young staff, I don't think that necessarily is a good thing. Might be, but not necessarily. CPD is not a lot of CPD going on. What is a lot of consultants earning a lot of money, like me, going into schools and saying, you know, what the SLT thinks the thing should be. Curriculum is the base from which all else flows, not the other thing. So what's the CPD about? It's about growth mindset and all this sort of stuff, which is all, you know, all this nonsense around the outside. You should be spending your time thinking of curriculum and seeing how, you know, in a good, that's base and superstructure, I was going to get into that, but it is the base through which all starts and all moves around, including discipline, including motivation, whatever people call it, you know, engagement, all these sort of weasel words that people throw at it. But all those things come from good design of curriculum. And lastly, if that is a national curriculum, you're absolutely right, because governments will throw in anything they want. That's a big problem, because it starts off as one thing you might agree with. Always think, if it's designed by people, who's designing it, and what if those people have the power to do it? I don't agree with it. So the government will change. So if they're designing the curriculum will change. And it might be a curriculum you don't agree with. The 2007 curriculum is a case in point of what happens when you've got government in charge of curriculum. It shouldn't be government in charge of curriculum, it should be teachers.
Can we thank our panel, please?